Chapter 5 The Slough. I was glad to leave Los Angeles and the stigma of failing 4th grade. However, Burbank was a bust. Dad tried to sell Amway door to door but was unsuccessful. We were there only a few months before moving to Marysville. My teacher took a genuine interest in me. She thought I had real potential and encouraged me to write poems and keep a journal. I would have enjoyed living in Marysville if we had stayed longer than 3 months. However, by January of '62, Dad decided Yuba City was really where we should be. Our new home was behind a levee, which held a slough from the local slaughterhouse. With both our folks working, Stan and I had lots of time to explore the neighborhood. Sitting on a cement dam at the water's edge, we would throw our fishing lines in and catch dozens of carp and other small fish. Sometimes a bare hook would fall in and a fish would grab it. It was a fisherman's dream come true for both of us. The water drained into the Yuba River, where a railroad trestle with 2 tracks ran high overhead. Climbing up the timbers, we would run down the tracks as fast as we could, taking several minutes to cross. The thrill of figuring out how we would escape if a train should come barreling through was heart-pounding. Once we reached the end, we would lean forward to catch our breath and come up laughing. There was no end to our adventures. Coming across an old raft in the brush, we climbed aboard and used a long pole to thrust our little barge from one side of the pond to the other. The slough had been low for the past 3 years due to a drought, but the fall of '62 and winter of '63 brought heavy rains, increasing the water to the levee's edge. Stan decided it would be great fun to use our raft to cross this newfound reservoir. Inviting a couple of children from the neighborhood, we climbed aboard and imagined we were on a boat with Captain Hook. We were delighted as Stan pushed us out toward the center, and we floated along with the current. Stan was 14, I was 12, and the youngsters were under 10. It never occurred to him that the water had risen above the crest of the slough's dam until his pole could no longer reach the bottom. We were drifting toward a spillway that fell into the swift Yuba River. Silently, Stan began crying out to the Lord to save us. He leaned down as far as he could, plunging the beam through the muddy water, searching for anything that would stop our tiny craft. His level of terror increased as we got closer to the falls. Our small passengers had no idea of the danger that lay ahead, but I realized things were not right. The closer we got to the falls, the faster the little craft swirled. I couldn't swim, and neither could our guests. His silent prayers became more earnest as he cried out to the Lord for help. Just then, our little barge felt a jolt as the pole hit solid ground. Stan quickly pushed with all his might toward the water's edge. After turning several circles, the craft landed next to the shore. Get off now," Stan urged. I could hear the panic in his voice. As I scrambled up the levee, I turned to watch our little raft float off, then disappear over the crest. I looked at Stan with wide eyes. Biting his lip, he slowly nodded, acknowledging my gut reaction. The children were escorted home, and no one was the wiser. Once school was out, Dad was ready to move again. This time it was to Bishop, a wonderful town at the foot of the eastern Sierra Nevadas. I probably loved Bishop more than any place we had lived. Stan loved it as well. With all of its rivers and streams, it was a fisherman's paradise. Our first lodging was a wood cabin that we rented from an old goat, Mrs. McLean. At least that's how I envisioned her as being. I wouldn't call the cabin a home, as there was only 1 bedroom, a tiny bathroom, no phone, and no TV. It was in the country and directly behind our landlady's house. There were streams that ran on either side of her property, where Stan and I would fish every chance we could. With fishing poles thrown over our shoulders, we'd walk toward the streams, catch grasshoppers for bait, and keep an eye out for Indian arrowheads. Mrs. McLean didn't like girls, and never missed an opportunity to tell me so. I'm not sure what it was she didn't like, but she tolerated me for Stan's sake. As cranky as she could be, I loved visiting her home. The kitchen had a wood-burning stove that she loaded every morning with timber from the forest behind her house. It was always warm and inviting, especially on cold, snowy days. Her house was full of antiques, including an amazing feather bed that was as high as my chest. It looked so inviting I wanted to climb up and sink into the mattress, but I wasn't allowed to touch it or anything else she deemed valuable. We moved to Bishop just in time for me to start 6th grade. I had never attended a school where the classes operated like a high school. Each course had a new teacher, and the students rotated to different rooms for each class. I could hardly wait to begin, as I was able to choose which subjects I wanted to take. Filled with excitement, I walked gingerly down the hallway. Suddenly, a couple of girls behind me chided, "Shake it, but don't break it. We might have to scotch tape it." Stunned, I felt very self-conscious and walked with as little hip movement as possible. However, nothing could dampen my enthusiasm as I was about to attend my first sewing class. I had been making doll clothes with my grandmother since I was 5, so I already felt like an expert. Looking around the room, I was energized as I spotted sewing machines, patterns, and dress forms. I was delighted as I crawled up on a stool that overlooked the cutting tables, covered with scissors, material, and pins. The teacher was a no-nonsense tutor. "Our first project is going to be an apron," she announced. Then she continued with her instructions, ending with, "Whatever you do, do not cut on a line that states folded edge." I picked out some material, pinned down the pattern, and began to cut. The scissors were sharper than any I had ever used. It was like magic as the blades cut smoothly along the entire solid line. The solid line that read, "Folded edge, do not cut." My teacher was visibly upset and berated me mercilessly in front of the class. She announced that since I had ruined that piece of material, that apron was going to be mine. The other girls giggled and snickered as I blushed and wished there was some way to melt into the floor. An incident like that would have squelched most girls' desire to ever sew again, but not mine. I was embarrassed, but my passion for sewing ran deep. It wasn't long before we moved from Mrs. McLean's rental into town, and once again Dad was frequently absent. However, he never took Stan with him after the problems we had in Los Angeles. Mom worked at J.C. Penney, and money was scarce. She barely made enough to pay the rent and put food on the table. More often than not, we'd have goulash for dinner, a small amount of hamburger boiled in a pot with some potatoes, carrots, and onions. Mom made a velvet crumb cake from a recipe on the box of Bisquick, and we played board games in the evening. We didn't own a television, so when President Kennedy was shot, we watched it on the neighbor's TV. Stan was disappointed to be living in town, but a whole new world opened for me. Around the corner were girls my age who introduced me to Barbie dolls and the Beatles. Susan and Kathy were the first normal friends I'd ever had. Their home was pleasantly large, and we played with our dolls and danced to "She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah." Their mother would drive us to the outskirts of town, where we'd look for Indian arrowheads and artifacts. As we passed crumbled walls where all that remained was our chimney, Susan and Kathy's mother would make up fascinating stories about the families who lived there over a century ago. Her stories seemed so real, it was easy to imagine how the pioneers struggled in this high desert. The 3 of us girls were mesmerized by each new story and begged her to tell us more. Bishop wasn't just a wonderful place. It was where the Lord gave me a new life, and I was born into the family of God. It happened one Sunday morning when the pastor spoke on Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God," and Ephesians 2:8-9, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." I realized I was a sinner, and there was nothing I could do to remove my sin. Only Christ could do that. God's grace convinced me and drew me to Himself. When the altar call was given, I sat frozen in my pew, tears running down my cheeks. I wasn't sure what to do. As soon as the service was over, I ran to find my Sunday school teacher. I told her I needed to be forgiven for my sins and asked the Lord to save me. My life was changed forever. I was baptized a few weeks later as a testimony of my faith. I wanted to live in Bishop for the rest of my life, but Dad was ready to move again. This time it was to Valley Springs, California. Dad was going to sell property at La Contenta Golf Estates. I sobbed as we drove away. I wasn't just leaving Bishop behind, I was also leaving Stan. He was going to be a junior, and Mrs. McLaren had offered him a room until he graduated from high school in 2 years. I don't recall my folks having any objections. As for me, it seemed that old goat had persuaded my brother to stay. I was extremely upset, but there was nothing I could do. So we did with Stan what we had done with Carol and Jim. We moved on without him. I was the last little piggy left at home.